Welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hi, this is Jessica with Syosset Library's Turn the Page podcast, and our guest today is, would you like to introduce yourself?
My name is Teddy Wayne.
And you wrote this book. Actually, you've written a few books, but this is, would you say that Apartment is a novella?
No, it's just a short novel. It's, I think, 195 pages is the total count. So certainly a novel, but on the shorter end, the shortest of my books.
It's always like that really thin line when you're reading a shorter book between, is there actually, I probably should know this and turn in my librarian card for not knowing this, but is there a page limit which constitutes that something is a novella versus a novel, a short novel?
I don't think there is. In fact, I'm working on something now that was pretty short, and I'm trying to decide that myself. Don DeLillo had a novel this past year that was 10,000 words, which if anyone else did it would be called a short story, but because it's Don DeLillo, I think they can get away with calling it a novel.
I think Don DeLillo can get away with calling it whatever he wants.
But in my research, I was looking like the high 20,000s, like 27,000 words seems to be about as low as you can get before you're in novella territory.
Interesting. Okay, well, now that we took that little side trip, so tell us about Apartment. Just a little background about myself. I was actually in high school during the time that Apartment took place. So 96 and 97 was my senior year of high school. But that area of the village, I used to tool around there a lot during that time. Obviously, didn't live there, but it had a bit of a mystique to a high schooler from Long Island as like the place to get your cool thrift clothing. And there were lots of colorful characters around there. But the idea of Stuytown, now, I definitely walked by it, but I wasn't aware of what it was called. And it would always just get to this point where if you walked too far, you'd see these buildings and you'd be like, wait a second, like, what is this place? Have I gone too far? So tell us about your novel. Tell us about Stuytown and how you decided to write this.
Sure. Well, you listed a number of the big details in it. It is set in 1996, 97. It is set primarily in Stuyvesant Town, which is this huge residential complex just north of the East Village in Manhattan, which the majority of apartments, I think especially back then, maybe all of them were rent stabilized. So the narrator of Apartment, he's unnamed throughout the book, is illegally subletting his great aunt's apartment there. And it's a 2-bedroom, but because it's illegal, he can never have roommates. He can't even have people over that much. He's afraid of getting caught. He's starting an MFA program, Master of Fine Arts in Fiction Writing at Columbia University. And early on, he meets a classmate from the Midwest who's there on a scholarship named Billy, who's a charismatic, wildly talented guy who's barely making ends meet in New York. And he offers to give Billy his spare room in his apartment rent-free in exchange for Billy's idea to cook and clean occasionally. So what develops is a friendship that's somewhat imbalanced by power, in that the narrator has this free place and is letting this guy live there almost as a servant in some ways, but is also a friendship. And the narrator, I should say, is extremely lonely, and Billy's really the first person he's thought about letting his guard down with. And then it follows their friendship over the course of that year as this power imbalance and other dynamics come into play, and other sources of friction, namely political and cultural tensions between the two guys.
It was really well written, and I think, now, did Apartment actually came out in 2020, correct?
Yep, late February 2020.
Which is sort of perfect considering how lonely of a year 2020 was for so many people, and even
Mhm.
2021 is probably going to be until there's, some sort of efficient vaccine rollout and plan to sort of return to whatever normal is going to be for a bit. Because I'm unconvinced that by the summer we're all going to be going to, like, I don't know, house parties and concerts or whatever anybody normally does just yet. So I really thought that it was almost beautiful that you have this novel about, number one, loneliness, which takes place in a very low during a very lonely time period now. How did you plan that? Did you
I,
see that
I
coming?
I did not plan COVID. Yeah, it came out a few weeks before the lockdowns commenced, and it's called Apartment because this apartment serves as a site of um, all these conflicts that come into play, but also the narrator spends a lot of time alone in his apartment,
Yes.
historically, and does throughout the book too. So, it's a little bit on the nose for what people were going through themselves this past year and perhaps beyond.
Definitely. And then the time period, how did you decide on that time period? It's very interesting for me because I was recently speaking to some people about 96, 97. I watched a documentary on HBO Max about Heaven's Gate, which took place, well, it actually was a lot longer lived than I thought it had, but the mass suicide took place, I believe, March of 97. But I recalled that during that time period, when you looked up, you could see the comet at any time. And the culmination of that mass suicide almost seems like loneliness of people who didn't fit.
Mhm.
So I wonder how you decided 96, 97 was the best time period for your narrator to live in and bring somebody like Billy into his apartment.
Yeah, I didn't think about the Heaven's Gate thing, but I was thinking more specifically about the political revolution that was undergoing in the U.S. at the time. 94 was the Newt Gingrich House Republican takeover, and even though 96 was Clinton defeating Dole fairly handily, the Democrats were continuing to lose power and had done so, with the exception of a short period in 2008 to 2010, and these past couple of years. The country has moved rightward since then in a pretty shocking way, especially lately. So Billy is revealed to be a somewhat moderate conservative from the Midwest, and the narrator, the unnamed narrator, is an East Coast liberal. And so that this felt like a good time to start exploring those tensions. Whereas 10 years later, in the height of, say, George W. Bush's tenure, or certainly the last few years, it would be less plausible that a Democrat and a Republican could share a house together, could share an apartment together and not beat each other's throats, or not have anything to say to each other. So it was the last time uh, the two poles of American politics could still come together, but it was starting to fray. Another reason to set it at that time was this is before the internet really took root. And so theirs is a friendship that's not mediated by technology. There's no cell phones. There's not even any email in it. Um, People are certainly not looking at their phones when they're hanging out with each other. So a time when I think friendships were a little bit more pure and a little cleaner, cleaner in that they were not having muddled distractions everywhere, and therefore I think more intense than they are now, where a lot of interaction now with friends is done by texting them as opposed to phone calls or in person. Certainly the last year, which is an exception, but before the pandemic, I used to talk on the phone all the time when I was younger. Part of this is just aging, but I rarely talk on the phone for long periods of time anymore. And I think even if I were younger, I probably wouldn't. And I think we're just now at this stage of communication that's always going to be several screens removed from each other.
That's a very good point. And a lot of times, I know that you're a parent and I'm a parent. And a lot of times, myself and my friends who are parents always talk about how we feel almost lucky that we were the last generation before social media really took over. I don't know what that says about us for deciding to procreate during this time. I certainly hope for the best for our children. Um, and so there's a really interesting theme about what constitutes masculinity woven within the story of the narrator and Billy. And also, as you had mentioned, political and socioeconomic nuances. For instance, the narrator, at first, like there are just little things that Billy does that, he's like, oh yeah, sure, like he works at a bar, which is like I guess Billy describes it as a dive bar, but it's like it's owned by a Vietnam vet, and the narrator doesn't see the it's like a painting of an eagle as being serious, versus like ironic, and just smaller things like that, but also just in a way of, as I was saying before, what constitutes masculinity, even though it isn't explicitly brought up.
Yeah, that's another reason to set in the 90s that I forgot to mention, which is that a time of flux for depictions of masculinity and American men's sense of themselves. Still, I'd say the dying gasps of 80s sort of machismo and Cold War kind of swagger, but that had gone. And the 90s we think of in hindsight as this very prosperous and peaceful and sort of more timid era, sandwiched between, as I said, Cold War Reaganism and George W. Bush's war on terror. You've got this period that was mostly marked by peace, at least for the American sense of themselves, and therefore it allowed in this space for figures like Leonardo DiCaprio in Titanic to become a sex symbol, who at the time looked very androgynous and had long hair and was not a buffed up steroidal action star. And we flipped around again, I'd say, and we now have these two extremes of both the steroidal action stars and the Timothy Chalamet types that are kind of Leonardo DiCaprio redux. But at that time was the first opening for that. It's a small throwaway line, but there's a reference to an advertisement for CK1, the unisex cologne.
Yeah.
And it's hard to imagine a unisex cologne or whatever fragrance, I guess not a cologne because it's unisex, with their ad campaign, which featured all these androgynous looking models. It's hard to imagine that coming out in 1986, whereas 1996 was the first era, I think, in American life, except for maybe the 60s or 70s, where you could have a little brief period too, where you could see that attaining real popularity.
It's actually interesting that you bring that up because I always think of just sort of the way that the cycle goes. You had grunge music where you would have these, versus heavy metal, which also the guys had long hair. But you had grunge music, which was like almost like a mix of heavier rock, but also more thoughtful. And you'd have, like Kurt Cobain and was it Gavin Rossdale? These, like I guess they're not really pretty boys, but they have the long hair. They're
wearing
not
cardigans, yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I always sort of saw that as like a cycle up from the 60s because their music is clearly very influenced by that. But it's true that Leonardo DiCaprio was very beautiful, and he and Claire Danes. There's a line I think where Billy says, "I like my." What is it? My men to look like men and my women to look like women, or
something like that.
Something like that. But there really was like an opening for a brief period of time. One thing I find interesting about now is you have somebody like Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, who's totally like this buff dude, but he started in WWE, which I consider, there's toxic masculinity. I consider that performative masculinity. But now he's still Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson with his muscles, but he's opening up to the idea of being like that, but also being more sensitive and being more open. So, all of this comes together in just this really good view of what that time period was. Um, and why these two people would interact. Another thing that I thought was very interesting was just sort of this strange or give and take between, and I mentioned it very briefly before, what the narrator assumed of Billy and what you know who Billy really was. I mean, he takes him home to meet his family for Thanksgiving. Um, and he's got this idea that even though Billy is from, this small town in the Midwest, he's got to be more liberal. But he sort of challenges that.
Yeah, there are a number of small, I didn't want to have these over the top political arguments, which they do a little bit during, they watch the 96 presidential election returns and they get into it a little then. But otherwise, to show the ways that their cultural divides, and especially their class divides, the narrator, I should also mention, is upper middle class. Billy is definitively working class. And that is, as you can imagine, the apartment situation with rent. His father pays his rent even as part of the unspoken conflict that Billy has, especially with the narrator.
Yeah.
And in reverse, too, the narrator reveres Billy for his working class origins and thinks of his fiction writing as more authentic and better simply because it comes from this real place of actual hardship, and as if he knows the real America, whereas he feels like he has lived this cosseted life that is separated from meaningful problems. They do a couple of trips. One of them is, as you said, to the narrator's home in suburban Massachusetts, where Billy feels a little out of place. They also do a trip to a wedding in semi-rural Pennsylvania, a cousin of Billy's, and the narrator feels both out of place, but also gawking, almost like a tourist about it, because this is his chance to see the real America with a tour guide. So it's an undercurrent and a running motif throughout it that this class divide is as much a problem and connected to their masculinity divide as anything else.
So that brings me to one more question. How did you decide to make both protagonists of this story writers?
I mean, it's you could say the most unimaginative choice there. There's not.
I actually didn't think so at
really?
all. I mean, I did not. But I'm curious as to, I'm curious as to your idea with it. Not me myself, not thinking it was unimaginative.
Well, I'm skeptical of books about writers, especially, this couldn't be more a guy in a writing program, and then the secondary character is also in a writing program. It could be a little too much, and I can recognize how some readers might be turned off by that. It also felt like a forum, though, for me, in addition to all these other ideas I've been mentioning about class and masculinity, a way to talk about talent and envy and competitiveness. And the writing world is rife with that. And especially these two aspiring writers who have yet to do much with it, but their talent is evident at an early stage. The narrator recognizes early on he's maybe not a natural at this. He's not deeply untalented. He's not a hack, but it's not his thing. And he's struggling with that because what else he's not sure what else will give his life meaning if not for this. Whereas Billy, it seems to come to him almost effortlessly. And there's, in the same way that his charisma draws friends and women to him seemingly effortlessly, this feels like yet another thing he's got going for him. But it calls into question this notion of privilege that by all normal metrics, the narrator is the privileged one, given his financial situation. And yet he feels as if Billy is in fact more privileged than he is in other ways that matter.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of people who would relate to that in the sense that they don't really know where they fit into society. He describes himself as a floater at one point,
Mhm.
which I thought was just so beautifully done, because the ideal has always sort of been, I mean, unless you're reading, Catcher in the Rye, and I know so many people idealized Holden. Now he seems to be sort of getting a backlash, looking at him from the past. But most media uh, wants, and especially in that time period, wants you to be with the in crowd, and there's like a very specific set of qualities you have to have for that. And if you feel like you're on the outside of that, you don't feel like there's any hope for you. Now, what a lot of people have been finding, I believe, is that even when you're talking to people who were on the in crowd, they kind of felt outside as well, but it's not the same thing.
Right. And there's even the other idea, which is he brings up at a party at the end, a grad student party with his classmates, where he feels like he's alienated even from them, and they are already a subculture that chooses to be isolated and to be a subculture essentially, and yet to be marginalized from the subculture is exceedingly lonely. It's one thing to be outside the mainstream, there's something heroic about that, but to be outside the mainstream and outside the alternative to the mainstream can feel truly isolating, which is what this main character feels.
So I loved the book. I'm
you.
going to tell the readers, even though we've been talking a lot about loneliness, I almost describe it as like a quiet thriller. Like you talk about quiet horror a lot lately, but it's like a quiet thriller, because even though we're not chasing a murderer or anything like that, your heart is definitely in your throat just with this conversation to see where this is going to go. And it's a quick read, and it's a good read, and I definitely highly recommend it.
Thank you. Yeah, quiet thriller is maybe a good way to put it. A book and then a book and movie that I thought of a little bit in the back of my head for writing this were The Talented Mr. Ripley, which also has a shy, introverted outsider who admires this charismatic guy. Difference there is that the shy outsiders is the working class one, and Ripley is that is, and the other guy is Dickie is rich. That, and also Single White Female a little bit.
Oh yes.
And this guy's not as warped or as murderous as those two, but he's got something going on with him that's a family resemblance to those two characters, and it's the desire to want the person who's right next to you, and it's not clear for you they want them or they want to be them. There's perhaps some homoerotic elements to it, and so those are some louder thrillers I was thinking about.
Yes.
This very quiet thriller.
Well, it was great, and I have to ask you what you're working on now.
I'm working on a new thing and hopefully finishing up soon. I try not to talk about projects while they're in progress, because I'll just kill my desire to finish them.
Then let's not do that, because I'd like to see more work from you.
Thank you very much.
All right. Well, once again, this was Jessica with Syosset Libraries Turn the Page podcast, and our guest today was
Teddy Wayne.
And we are going to close this chapter of Turn the Page.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.